So-called biblical archaeology can be long on speculation, short on facts, and colored grotesquely by theological predispositions. Not a few scholars consider biblical archaeology conceptually biased and incapable of contributing to a realistic understanding of ancient Near Eastern history, but unfortunately some of these sentiments are correct. But the astute archaeological scholar knows full well that the that the dominant conventional theories about Old Testament Torah textual origins are themselves highly speculative in nature and are founded on presuppositions now known to be false or even fictions. There is, however, a proper scientific methodology by which we can approach the relationship, if there is any, between biblical text and ancient Near Eastern archaeology and history. I call this the historical synchronisms and material specificity approach, HSMSA for short. And as much as humanly possible, this approach avoids speculation and focuses only on factual data in ascertaining the relationships between text and physical reality. And I present the Genesis-Sodom narratives as a model for this application, by which these narratives are demonstrated to be consistent with all the known and testable facts relevant to this case. So I don't know how many of you have much of a biblical background, but we're going to stretch it a bit. The accounts in Genesis show that the location of Sodom was only generally perceived by the Israelites as lying somewhere in the Dead Sea region, and two possibilities exist. Of course, this is Walter Rast, who excavated at Babadra in the southern Dead Sea area. So two possibilities exist. One is that Sodom was a fictional place to begin with, and that a city by this name never existed at all, but came into being as an element in a local story or a tale stressing, now I want you to focus on this, a destruction severe enough to account for the startling physiology of the Dead Sea region. So, you see where I'm going with this. Here's Martin Mulder. He says, but it's highly uncertain, if not improbable, that the vanished cities of the Pentapolis will ever be recovered. Still, on the whole, it is by no means impossible that a big catastrophe in prehistoric times did live on in the memory of the peoples living around the Dead Sea, and that later on, the essential features of that tradition were taken over by the Israelites. Therefore, it became a part of the Bible in the book of Genesis. So, given that neither Rast nor Mulder, now these two guys are really good archaeologists, but neither one of them, or Albright, who's the most powerful archaeological scholar of the 20th century, Lapp, or any other southern Sodom proponent, that is, those who put Sodom at the south end of the Dead Sea, none of them ever provided an adequate analysis of the relevant geographical texts for the cities of the plain. They just didn't. They ignored it. So on what did they rely in arriving at their conclusion about Sodom's location? Well, essentially they pondered their own navels. They pondered their own assumptions and the assumptions of others, while virtually avoiding the relevant text and the proper scientific and historiographical analyses that might possibly have reasonably ascertain either the veracity or the fictionality of those narratives. I find this is true a lot in archaeology and even more so in anthropology, but it's what people do. By the way, why is the text so important in the case of this infamous city called Sodom? I'll tell you why, because it's only mentioned in the Bible. If the Bible's the only text you have to deal with, then you better deal with the text because you have nothing else. Well, except toward the end, I hope someone will ask, if I forget, we have found Sodom in the Egyptian records. Ooh, it's new. It's not even published yet, but hey, I don't care. They also assumed that the conventional wisdom of archaeology about the Dead Sea region settlements was correct. But it wasn't correct. It was completely wrong. And it's pretty easy to show. So, they operated with erroneous assumptions about Dead Sea settlements. Why are we going backwards? Oh, And these ideas that they had still influence the most used maps, perpetuating the same critical errors and omissions of the past. It just keeps going on and on and on. Show you what I mean. Now, Anson Rainey was a really good friend of mine who produced, he was the best historical geographer of the ancient Near East period. And here's from his book, Sacred Bridge. Here's an early Bronze Age site map, and I want to show you this. It's of this area right here. Now, the early Bronze Age site map is blank on the east side of the Jordan River, northeast of the Dead Sea. This area is blank. Look at it. Nothing there. Not a single city named. Here's his IBA site map of that same area, and look at it. Nothing on the east side of the Jordan River except Iktanu. And here's the funny thing. Iktanu now, after 20 some odd years of our project in that area, is now known as one of the many satellite towns of the big town that we've been excavating. So everybody assumed that Iktanu was sort of the big dog on the block. No, it was the Chihuahua, and we've got the Great Dane. Here's the Middle Bronze Age site map, and of course this is the key period because this is the time of the destruction of Sodom, given a sort of a face value interpretation of the biblical chronology. The whole thing is blank. There it is. It's blank. Now this was edited and updated in 2015, this particular book. And everybody else follows suit. Nobody has anything on this piece of real estate. Well, after almost 20 years of exploring, researching, and excavating in this area, I'm going to show you what it looks like. That's the northeast of the Dead Sea now. Look at that. Compare it. What everybody thought? Nothing. Nothing. And then, all of a sudden, that. There were 14 major archaeological sites that have never really been published on the east side of the Jordan River, north of the Dead Sea. And so, what does this tell you? It tells you that there's a whole lot out there that people don't know about. Even the best scholars, the best archaeologists, the best geographers are ignorant about so much that exists. Now, we could extrapolate that across the whole planet, but this is my territory. And it works here as well. So, what gets us from that to that? Well, if you want to read about that, here's the book. Published by Simon & Schuster. There it is. Now, this only takes us through our first 7 excavation seasons, but it'll give you the nuts and bolts, the background, and all the details of how we got into this, but it's a good read. Now, here's a little statement I like to use. It's a little bit of a poke in the ribs to some of my colleagues, but I like it. If in the past archaeologists and Bible scholars had taken the Sodom tales seriously and had paid closer attention to the abundant geographical details embedded in the relevant biblical text, they would have discovered the marvelous civilization in the biblical land of the Kikar, often called the cities of the plain, the land of the plain, a long time ago. But they didn't. They didn't pay attention to the text. They assumed it was fiction, and therefore they didn't investigate the area, and they found nothing. They didn't, and they didn't. But we did. We paid attention. And guess what? We did. The whole concept of the southern Levant. By the way, before I read this one, isn't it interesting that 20 years ago, everything was a blank in that area? We now know that Tal el-Hammam was the largest continuously occupied Bronze Age city in the entire southern Levant. It was the big dog. It was probably the city that fomented the rebellion against Lower Egypt around the 18th century, and these were the Hyksos rulers, the Asiatic Semitic Canaanites who ruled Egypt for 150 years. Where did they come from? The leaders came from Sodom. They came from this area, and I'll talk about that at the very, very end without a slide. But what's interesting about that is at one point, for 400 years, Tal el-Hammam is the only fortified city. It's the only true urban center in the entire southern Levant. At the end of the early Bronze III period, everything went belly up due to climate. Everybody else crashed. Tal el-Hammam actually grew with its number of satellites because people abandoned other locations and went there. And so for almost 500 years, Tal el-Hammam was the only city in the southern Levant operating. Interesting. Well, back to the story. Overburdens of literary origin theories and conventional wisdom regarding the historical versus fictional nature of extant ancient textual materials must be laid aside in favor of an objective treatment of the synthetic, that is, the testable elements of the Sodom narratives in our particular case. This we must do. But most importantly, you can't assume anything. You have to start from zero and work with what you have available to you. And as I always tell my students, in every investigation, you have to learn how to run the table. It's like playing pool, right? You want to clear everything off. Every possible line of evidence that has to be investigated, that needs to be investigated, must be investigated, because it's the one you don't check out that will come back to bite you. So assume nothing, which we did. The scientific means of locating an ancient city. Now, if you ask most people, most archaeologists and most anthropologists don't invent ways of methodologies of investigating these things, but you have to have a way. You have to have a methodology. You have to have a framework to do this kind of thing. Well, I'm going to give you mine. First thing you have to do is you have to analyze all ancient texts in order to extract the embedded geographical data. That you must do. You must analyze the geographical language for specificity. Is the language literal? Is it formulaic? Is it hyperbolic? Is it phenomenological? Is it symbolic? What is it? You have to understand the language, which means, knowing a little bit of Hebrew and Greek, Aramaic, and Arabic and Akkadian is a good idea. Assess both the known and unknown geographical quanta from extracted textual data. You have to know what's known and what's not known, and you have to know how to triangulate between the two. Then you have to assemble a theoretical map. You have to work from the known geodata to the unknown geodata and use rigorous logic in doing that, and then you create a map. And then you need to analyze the chronological occupational parameters suggested or required by the relevant text. It isn't good enough that you're looking for for a story that allegedly happened in the Bronze Age, and you find a site that seems to work geographically, but it doesn't work chronologically because the only thing you find there is from the Iron Age. So you have to put the chronological into the mix. So the chronological data has to become part of the geodata set. And then you have to analyze the relevant physical data from archaeology, geology, paleoclimatology. By the way, where does that even come into the biblical text? Listen, the biblical text is very detailed. It says when Abraham came into the land, there was great famine. Whoa, now we're talking climatology. All right? Paleobotany, other disciplines, we have to run the table on every possible relevant line of evidence. Then we have to assess the points of correspondence and or departure between the theoretical text map and the physical data from the proposed locations. So, where does that leave us then? If these are, and I'm talking about the Sodom narratives, if these are descriptions of living Bronze Age sites, then the stories are authentic, perhaps even eyewitness accounts. If, however, they are merely descriptions of ruins that are still visible in the Iron Age, what we're talking about is grandfathers spinning stories to their grandchildren about, oh, you see that big ruin over there? Your great Uncle Joshua destroyed that city. Right? Making up stuff. And that's what I'm talking about here. So if you get descriptions of ruins that are still visible during the Iron Age, then the story about Sodom, which supposedly happened way back in the Bronze Age, are at least geographically authentic. That is, they're etiological. It's a story spun on an existing visible ruin as to how it possibly got there. And so one of these two things are true, but as I always tell my colleagues, if they were making up stories, they were making up stories based on what they observed, based on what they saw, what they could walk over. And by the way, look at Jerusalem, where Jerusalem is located, or the cities on the plain, on the Madaba plain on the east side. They're all within a half a day's walk or a day's walk to this site. So there'll be a lot of people picnicking down there, trying to figure out what in the world went on here. What were all these cities and what happened to them? So no matter how you slice this thing, the biblical geography is a fact-based geography, not a mythical construct. And I gave this in a lecture many years ago. In fact, in Amman, to the Friends of Archaeology in Amman. And I made the statement, ancient people never invented fictitious geography. There's no such thing as Middle Earth or like 5-acre wood in ancient writing. So regardless of whether the storylines are fact or fiction, they are layered over a real-world geography. And one of the ladies in the room, head of one of the archaeological organizations there in Amman, she said, Dr. Collins, isn't that a little bit dangerous? You said never say never. Because I said, they never invent fictitious geography. Never say never, she said. And I said, point well taken. And I turned around to the blackboard, and then I turned back around and I said, can you give me an example of a fictitious geography from the ancient world? She said, no. And I turned around to the blackboard again, and then I turned back around and I said, I'm really interested in that. And if you ever do find one, would you please, a fictitious geography, would you please let me know? And oh, by the way, also let me know the criteria whereby you determine it's fictitious. I've never heard back. That was almost 20 years ago. So we're not talking about made-up geography. Whatever else the storylines say, we're talking about real-world geography, including Sodom and Gomorrah and all the other cities of the plain. Well, if you go back to the 19th century, when people still had the ability to think, as they analyzed the biblical text, this is an old map from a Bible published in 1889. And I want you to notice where the cities of the plain are located. North of the Dead Sea, not in the south area, where everybody else wants to put them in the 20th century. How did they get here? They got there by analyzing the geography of the text and following it place to place to place, because actually in the Torah literature in particular, but the Old Testament in general, these are serial geographies. This is not theological literature. These are serial geographies. Now, say, well, why are they not theological literature? They're not theological literature because everybody in the ancient world, I don't care if you're Babylonian, Egyptian, Hittite, doesn't matter, you have a religious agenda that drives your worldview. So you can't pick a non-religious ancient text out of the ancient world. You can't, because everything about their worldview, their way of life, was tied to their view of everything in reality. And so they were following the Genesis text because it takes you to real places. Yeah, does the Bible have a theological agenda? Are there threads of that? Sure. But first of all, the Bible is written as a geographical historical document to account for all of these places in the Near East that are mentioned, and they tell stories over the landscape. So if you look at it from that point of view, they cover the entire landscape and leave nothing untouched. They have a story for every place. Well, Well, here's Genesis 13. Now I've taken out the incidentals, left the geography. So here it is. So Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev. Lot went with him. From the Negev, he went from place to place. There's that serial geography idea. Until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai. Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of Yahweh, like the land of Egypt towards Zoar. Could be Zoan, but that's another lecture. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. And Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now, the word plain shows up in that text 3 times. But what's interesting about it is that the Hebrew word there doesn't even mean plain. It's not even a geographical term at all. It's translated plain. Sometimes translators kind of think about it ahead of time what they think it might mean, and they just go with it. Well, they got it totally wrong in this case because it's the word kikar. Kikar means a talent of metal, a flat circular ingot of metal, or a flat circular loaf of bread, a.k.a. tortilla, if you've ever been to Taco Bell. Tortilla. Flat bread, round bread. Egyptian kurkur can also mean to draw a circle in the sand with a stick. We're talking about circles here. We're talking about phenomenology. And remember, it's the cities of the Kikar, Ha-Kikar, and the Kikar of the Jordan, the circle of the Jordan, the circle of the cities of the plain. Here it is. The Jordan Valley comes down and then opens up into a wide circular alluvial plain north of the Dead Sea. That's the disk. That's the phenomenological, we call it a phenomenological secondary referent. Why did they call it Ha-Kikar? Because it looks like a disk. Now, they didn't have satellite maps. Okay. Oh, it looks like a disk from space. No, they were on the ground. But if you go on the ground and you go to the middle of this place and you do a 360, you see that's green farmland all the way around. You're standing in the middle of a green circle. And in the ancient world, it was very impressive to them, and so they called it the disk. Now, Hayarden means the descent or the descending of what? Of fresh water. The descending of the water, it comes down the Rift Valley to the Dead Sea. And when the Hayarden, the descending, reaches the lowest spot on the surface of the earth, 1,300 feet below sea level, the surface of the Dead Sea, then the Hayarden, the descending, ends. It terminates right there. So, this strict biblical conception of the descending of the fresh water, which terminates at the lowest spot on the face of the earth with dead water full of anhydride salts. Don't drink it. It's over. The Hayarden is over. Hayarden is north of the Dead Sea, period. Anybody that would say otherwise is kind of kooky. My good friend Anson Rainey, before he passed away some years ago, in our correspondence said it's usually ignored that the term Arava, which wilderness, applies to the Jordan Valley north of the Dead Sea. So it's too bad the author there didn't use the term Kikar. The map in the Atlas, the sacred bridge that we just referred to, does need revision. And Genesis 13 has to do with the high ground east of Bethel, so the references to the Kikar fit better with the area north of the Dead Sea. And I think, and if Anson hadn't passed away a few years after he said this, they would have revised the Atlas and got it right. So Sodom can only be there. It cannot be in the southern Dead Sea region, period. So in that discussion. Well, there they are. As a result of what we've been doing the last 20 years, you have el-Hammam as the big fortified city surrounded by other smaller fortified towns and villages and hamlets, and it probably is the most concentrated civilization center in the entire southern Levant during the Bronze Age. So the Genesis writer assumes that Sodom was the biggest city on the eastern Jordan disk. 3 things here. It's always listed first in the list. This is the ancient way of thinking. The big one is always listed first. It's the only one in the story mentioned by itself. Sodom shows up over and over and over again by itself. And King Bera is the only one of the 5 cities that has a voice. He speaks. He's part of the narrative. Nobody else is even mentioned in terms of saying anything. So this is very easy from this to determine that Sodom was the biggest city, or it's presented in the text as the biggest city on the eastern Jordan disk north of the Dead Sea. So how difficult was that to find? It was not difficult to find. If someone handed me a map of California and I followed the map to L.A., could I be the discoverer of L.A.? No. People always ask me, oh, Collins, yeah, you discovered Sodom. Well, kind of, but there was a really good map. And here she is. I mean, el-Hammam is not just the largest Bronze Age city on the eastern Jordan disk. She's larger by several orders of magnitude. Take Jerusalem during the Middle Bronze Age. You can put 10 of those inside the fortifications at el-Hammam. It's a 300-acre footprint, 62 acres inside massive city walls. Take the traditional side of Sodom Babadra in the south. You can put 10 of those inside the city walls of el-Hammam with space left over. This is the big city on the eastern Jordan disk. And let's introduce that chronology. Genesis 10 talks about them. That takes us back to the building of the first cities. The reference to the building of the first great cities, that's the early Bronze Age, the fortified cities. That's Genesis 10. Abraham and Lot of the later chapters in Genesis belong to the Middle Bronze Age. That's a piece of cake. Even Albright understood that. So here's the occupational profile of el-Hammam. You start the Chalcolithic period. Actually, we go back, we're as old as Jericho. We go back to the Neolithic period, but, it's not only so much room on the slide. So I start with the Chalcolithic period, go to the early Bronze Age, the intermediate Bronze Age, the Middle Bronze Age for almost 2,500 years, fortified nonstop. Biggest city in the southern Levant. And then all of a sudden, that red line appears, a 7th century occupational gap. It goes belly up. What happened? This is just one of our almost 100 radiocarbon dates from that destruction layer, showing you it hovers right around 1700 BC plus minus 50. And in the following slide, this is just real quick, the early bronze defenses in yellow, the middle bronze defenses in orange, and the MBA accesses and the reuse of the early Bronze Age defenses in green. Pretty impressive. Look at that. Just look at the size of the people. Look at the size. This is just the lower city. This is the defenses going around the lower city. And we did find the gateway, and the footprint of the gateway tells us that's a very, very large structure indeed. It is of the Minoan palatial style from the Middle Bronze Age, which is a whole other lecture. But here's Danette and I standing atop of the rampart system. We are, and I'm presenting this at ASOR in the fall, we now know that el-Hammam was the first Middle Bronze Age ramparted fortification system in the entire southern Levant. We were the first. How do we know that? Because at the end of the intermediate Bronze Age and the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, we're the only city in the southern Levant. We're it. Nobody else. Well, then who did it? We did it. We introduced it. And by the way, we're the only fortification system whose ramparts, not just the walls, but the ramparts are made almost completely of unfired mud brick, sun-dried mud brick. We estimate, based on the size of our ramparts, that just the building of the ramparts took somewhere between 40 and 60 million mud bricks to make. That's expensive, it's time-consuming, and nobody else did it. Every other Middle Bronze fortification system after this is built of rammed earth. They ain't going to make bricks. They're going to just pile this stuff up and do that to it. So, el-Hammam is very special in many ways. Just a little bit of excavation from a couple of years ago. And this is the palace. This is the Middle Bronze Age palace. It took us about 8 meters to get down there because we are underneath the Iron Age. And there's the palace complex. What's interesting about the palace complex, this is just the upper city. The palace complex is big. Its footprint is slightly larger than the White House. It's a pretty good building. So, and those outer walls are almost 2.5 meters thick. It's like 8-9 feet. So, pretty substantial building. Here's Dr. Lane Rittmeyer's estimate of what the city looked like. We have excavated most of these areas represented, not completely, but we do have excavated here and here and here and all along this wall, the palace area here, and so we pretty much know what everything looks like. And what's the interesting thing is after the destruction, nothing was ever built over the lower city. So you can walk around and look at the walls of the lower city without even excavating a lot of the places. So there it is. So here she is. Now I want to bring about some ideas, some facts. Go with the facts and then see where the facts force you to go. Here's a fact. Bronze Age civilization on the eastern Jordan Disk, the Kikar, with Tal el-Hammam as its cultural center, flourished continuously for over 2,000 years, nonstop. Probably much longer than that. This Bronze Age civilization, including Tal el-Hammam, terminated abruptly toward the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and this whole area remained unoccupied for most of the next 7 centuries. Nobody could live there. Here's a critical question from those two facts. Why did the best watered agricultural land in the region remain without cities and towns for the ensuing 7 centuries following its MB2 destruction? Why? Here's another fact. The vast majority of the early Bronze Age cities and towns in the southern Levant were destroyed and or ceased to function at the end of the early Bronze III period, that's about 2500 BC, due to a serious downturn in the regional climatological regime and related factors. That's just a fact. Here's another fact. Tal el-Hammam and the majority of its neighbors on the eastern Jordan Disk were virtually unaffected by that 2500 BC climatological downturn, and they continued to thrive into and through the intermediate Bronze Age when nobody else did, and all the way through the Middle Bronze Age. And then, here's another fact. Having thrived through the intermediate Bronze Age, most of the sites in the region did not, as we said. Then Tal el-Hammam and all of its Jordan Disk neighbors toward the end of the Middle Bronze Age succumbed to a destructive phenomenon that obliterated their long-enduring civilization when most of the surrounding region continued happily into the late Bronze Age with no effect at all. So, that's the picture. If you follow all of that dotted yellow line are the highways. These are the ancient roads, and they all converge at Tal el-Hammam, and everything inside that circle went belly up. Suddenly, quickly, mysteriously, but if you follow out from those roads, all the towns going out about 25 kilometers to 50 kilometers or further from those roads continued on just fine without a break. Something happened here. So, here's the critical question. Based on all of those facts, why did the best watered agriscape in the southern Levant flourish through the EB3 climatological catastrophe when almost no other areas did? How did they survive that? Simple answer. Lots of surface water. They have the Jordan River, they have springs, they're surrounded by 2 perennial rivers coming on the north and the south on each side. They had water, and they had lots of it. In fact, the biblical text says that the area of Sodom, the Kikar, was watered like Egypt. How is Egypt watered? The Nile, it doesn't rain. The Nile River flows, and it overflows its banks in the spring melt of the year, and they plant their crops behind the receding waters and the newly deposited silt. That's the that's the hydrological regime in the southern Jordan Valley. It's a Nile in miniature. They didn't need the rain, they could survive, and in fact they did. But here's another critical question. Why did Tal el-Hammam and the other cities and towns of this best watered agriscape in the region come to a screeching halt toward the end of the Middle Bronze Age? remaining unoccupied for the next 7 centuries, when virtually every site in the surrounding area continued to thrive into the late Bronze Age with no problems at all. When everybody went down, el-Hammam successfully stayed up. When nobody else went down, el-Hammam and its city group crashed. What happened? And why? And the water didn't go away. Why did people stay out of this region for 700 years? Well, I'll tell you, whatever event this was, it literally destroyed the surface soil. It destroyed the agricultural soil. It took 7 centuries for the agricultural soil to return. That's just soil science. Well, the answer is becoming clearer, and I'm going to poke into that answer just a bit. Toward the end of the Middle Bronze Age, around 1700 BC, a Tunguska-class meteoritic airburst event. By the way, Genesis 19 describes that as Goprit Va'esh, burning stone, not brimstone, bad translation, burning stone and fire from Yahweh out of the heavens. Does that sound like something familiar to you? It does to me. And it exploded over the north into the Dead Sea, bringing the civilization in the land of the Kikar to a catastrophic end. And all those cities and towns, the entire human population and animals, even the agricultural land itself, it was a complete destruction. And it all happened in a fraction of a second. How do we know all this? Well, there's been a lot of research done. I'm going to introduce that to you. What's interesting about our particular airburst event is that most of these are exceedingly rare, and not rare geologically, but I mean, how many of us have experienced those in our life? It's not common, thankfully. But in the past 5,000 years, there is only one of these events that has struck an urban region, an urban area. And that's why it's of such interest. What happens when one of these hits an urban area? And we have a good phenomenological description of that event preserved in an ancient text. It took place toward the end of the Middle Bronze Age. We know that from the archaeology at precisely the location indicated in the text, the land of the Kikar. It's the right place, it's the right time, and it's all the right stuff. So that convergence of place, time, stuff, and story demonstrate the accuracy of the historical framework of those Abraham-Sodom narratives. So, let's go back to Rast and Mulder. Here's Rast. A destruction severe enough to account for the startling physiology of the Dead Sea region. And it's by no means impossible that a big catastrophe in the prehistoric times did live on in the memory of the peoples living around the Dead Sea. These should be heeded not on the basis of their etiological predispositions, I'm talking about Rast and Mulder, and their inadequate understanding of the Dead Sea region's wider archaeological record, but on the basis of simple, proper scientific and historiographical analysis. That's where it should go, and we should leave it there. Simply put, here it is. There is no textual, geographical, chronological, archaeological, or astrophysical evidence to locate Sodom and the cities of the Kikar anywhere but at Tal el-Hammam. Everything else should be taken off the table. Now, the Sodom narratives carefully mark out a location for the cities of the Kikar north of the Dead Sea on the east side of the Jordan River, where in fact the ruins of a significant Bronze Age civilization exist and were destroyed by a fiery cosmic cataclysm toward the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Such a high degree of correspondence between the text and the ground cannot be merely a coincidence. Cannot be. Well, if you want to read about all that stuff in detail, here it is, published in 2021 in Nature Scientific Reports. A Tunguska-sized airburst destroys Tal el-Hammam, a middle broad city in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea. By the way, the follow-on paper to this with even more evidence has just been published, and in another peer-reviewed journal. And So that's pretty exciting. I just found that out before we got to this conference, and very exciting. I was not on this paper. I refused to be a part of this. They said, "Why not?" "Because we're working on your stuff." "Yeah, but you don't know the archaeological community, the people that surround me." And there's sort of a little bit of an anti-biblical bias hanging out there, and they just don't put my name on it, just talk about it. Well, they even mentioned in there that could this airburst to be possibly the underlying event that and a historical memory of such that gave rise to the story of Sodom? Say that? They mentioned that in the paper. And I said, please don't do that. Don't mention it. Well, if we don't mention it, then somebody's going to point out, why didn't you see that? Why didn't you mention it? So they mentioned it. And you should have seen the people crawling out of the woodwork, accusing nature scientific reports of caving to the biblicists and the biblical archaeologists. Oh, it was pretty sad. But and they made attempts to overthrow it, get it retracted. It went through 4 peer reviews, people. 4 subsequent peer reviews. Guess what didn't happen? Didn't get retracted. It's still there. It's still published. And it will remain so. Now, when you talk about destructions, I'm going to try to wrap this up real quick here. When you talk about destruction options, here's the options that you get in the Middle East, in the Near East. You can get destroyed by warfare, fire, a generalized fire, a localized fire, earthquakes. You can get floods if you're just about anywhere. You can get tsunamis if you're on the coast. And there can be volcanism, but the volcanism goes back at least 35,000, 40,000 years. That's the earliest one. There has been no volcanism in the Jordan, in the Rift Valley, in what we might call even prehistoric to historic times, since human beings have been building architecturally in that area. So you can't blame the destruction on that sort of thing. But what I did was I came up with proxies for every one of those categories that I just gave you. Whole list of proxies, because you have to think through these things. What's interesting about that is that none of the proxies for any of those events exist in the Middle Bronze destruction layer at el-Hammam. None of them. Ours are all weird. They're strange. Here they are. Here are the proxies. A deep mixed matrix, deep, I'm talking about 1 meter to 2 meters, bricks, pieces, frags, bricks, burnt wood, plaster, pottery, objects, human bones, miscellaneous debris. When we started looking at this 20 years ago and been looking at it for the last 20 years, we came to it, we lovingly refer to it as the Cuisinart effect. That's what it looks like. You put a city in a blender and hit the button. That's what this destruction matrix looked like. It was violent. Makes earthquakes look calm, roofs just collapse, and in situ pottery just stays on the floor and gets crushed. I mean, it looks rather calm. Frequent vitrified pottery. I'm talking about pottery, the internal zircons of which have boiled. Surface glass, superficial surfaces melted into glass. And you go under the melt glass, where it's not even melted, it's just, you can see that it's been heated, but in the SEM scans, there are boiled zircons, off-gassing. You know what the temperature of a boiling zircon is? Just short of 5,000 degrees centigrade, 4,000 degrees centigrade, 3,900 and change. Pretty toasty. That's not even on the melted surface. In fact, the heat was so high to melt the surface that if it had lasted more than a fraction of a second, it would have melted the whole piece of pottery itself. It was just slumped into a pile of glass. It was a flash heat. So we have cases of more than 8,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm talking about probably 20. A flash heat that melts things. We have melted bricks, we have melted plasters, and these things are probably on the parapets and on the first subject to the first temperature blast. Massive quantities of ash and a whole lot of post-event smoldering. Only heavy objects remain on floors. Mostly they've been pushed out of living positions and are often impacted by other objects that have been airborne. Airborne objects. We have a casserole, big Middle Bronze Age casserole, 40 to 50 centimeters off the floor, smash against a against a southwest-facing wall. We find that all over the place. All of our stuff gets airborne. Anything it's not like, we have a 500-kilo grinding stone, saddle quern, that is literally turned from the southwest toward the northeast a half turn. And all the carbonized grain on it hits the floor and smashes up against the southwest-facing wall just to the northeast of it. Lots of that. There's directionality here. We hardly ever find anything in living position as you would find in almost every other kind of destruction. Sheared off mud brick superstructures filled by the terminal destruction matrix. I'm talking about walls that are 5 meters thick, 3 meters thick of mud brick with huge stone foundations. They are sheared off about this high. What's that height? It's the height of the rampart. Rampart's 100 feet high. The upper city rampart is 100 feet high and almost 100 feet thick at the base in some places. Something's happening to push that force up and horizontally, and it's just literally shearing. Oh, your city must have just melted away in the rainy seasons over hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, we tested that hypothesis, and we went to the places where all of that mud brick detritus would go if it melted away, and guess what? There isn't. There's no mud brick detritus. The mud bricks are just gone. Well, so we have almost no intact or broken in place pottery on floors, which is typical of all the other scenarios. Thousands of frags from different vessels strewn in a southwest to northeast pattern or in suspended clusters, many joins variously scorched. I'll show you some of that in a second. Evidence of post-event disintegration is virtually absent. 600 to 700 year occupational gap across that whole area, and no less than 26 bolide microproxies in the terminal destruction matrix from the Middle Bronze Age, and not found above and not found below. All right. That's from that paper, Superimposition of the Spread of the Tunguska Explosion over Tal el-Hammam. We also think that Jericho may have also been taken out, kind of collateral damage on the western perimeter of this explosion, because Jericho does go down at the end of the Middle Bronze Age and doesn't come back up till about 1400 BC, which is kind of interesting. So I just want to show you that. Here's a chocolate on white. Why did I pick the chocolate on whiteware? Because I like chocolate and I like milk. And the chocolate on whiteware, I have talked to all my colleagues who are experts. That's my bailiwicks, ancient pottery. And none of my colleagues, I ask them, have you ever seen a storage jar chocolate on white? No. We have the only known chocolate on white storage jar. You'll see in a second, you'll see why we call it that. But I want you to see this pattern. Each one of these squares is 6 by 6 meters. That's our grid. By the way, how big is Tal el-Hammam? We have over 13,000 6 by 6 meter squares on our site grid. That's just in the fortified part. That's how big it is. Now, if you look at this, these are sherds, locations of sherds from this same vessel. We call this same vessel sherd scatter. Isn't that cool, the way we scientifically make up stuff? You know, sherds from the same vessel. And okay, let's make it sound really good. Sherd scatter. Same vessel, sherd scatter. Sounds really official. But anyway, here's this. Look at this. Now, we can't, it's very difficult to do this with thankfully we have a lot of painted pottery. It's very difficult to do it if the pottery's not painted. Because it's like looking at a jigsaw puzzle that's just all white or just all black. It's just, how do you do that? And all the people, and no two puzzle pieces are the same shape, right? So this is how difficult. But if they're painted, you can look in the lab with all the stuff spread out and you go, oh, look, I think that goes with that. And oh, yeah, it goes together. But what was funny about this is that all of the same vessel sherd scatter that we've tracked goes from the southwest to the northeast. It's all directional. And here it is. This is the tracking of this particular vessel directionally and in the matrix. Some of it's found low in the matrix. The matrix is almost 2 meters deep. It's found low in the matrix, and it's found high in the matrix. And it's found everywhere in between. What does that prove? It proves that this is a single event destruction matrix. Pure and simple. And it's all going southwest to northeast. Here she is, chocolate on white ware. But you see the interesting bands of scorch? Look at the scorch bands. By the way, you say, well, some of them are scorched, and then some of the pieces are like untouched. That's what happens when an explosive event happens, and some of these things land in different places. It depends on what happens to be burning or scorching next to the place that they land, and so they all have different scorch patterns. Here's some scorch patterns on the inside. Oh, and people. The people were either probably just simply burned in place, vaporized, but some were blown into pieces. We have bones strewn throughout. By the way, I got a report, and this is all coming from one particular location, the ring road between the palace and the city wall in that location. And that's the bone scatter. We can't even tell who's what. This could be 8 people, 10 people, 1 person, 3 people. We don't know. But it's all bits and pieces. I just got a report from our analysts, from our bone analysts up in Canada. Can't say even the university right now. But the world's leading experts in bone analysis, faunal bone analysis. And we sent them hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of faunal bones and other bones, maybe even some human bones from the palace itself. And they called me and they said, sit down. We're looking at all your bones, not some of them, all of them, every single bone that you sent us. We know cooked bones. We know fried bones. We know fricasseed bones. We know every kind of cooking, every kind of heat, every kind of thing that can possibly be applied to a bone in terms of normal living. But all of our team look at this stuff and they say this. Here's what they said. We've never seen any burn like this in their 30, 40 years of working with bones from archaeological sites, and they are the leading experts. And I said, makes sense to me. It makes sense. Well, did we find the city of Sodom? Yeah. I'm going to close with this. 5 minutes. Here's the big one. This is the big one. People have been asking me for 20 years, if Sodom was such a big deal and this event was such a big deal, how come we know nothing of it from the other ancient records outside the Bible? Never say never. This comes from my good friend Anson Rainey. I'm looking at his paper, his excursus on the Egyptian execration texts. These are from the latter part of the Middle Bronze Age, and they're Theban pharaohs in the south cursing all of these Canaanites who've taken over Lower Egypt in the north. 2 sets of them, the early execration texts, early curse texts, and the later curse texts. And Anson wrote a paper, and he put all of these cities mentioned in the execration text on a map. I looked at the map. There's a site called Shutu. That can be rendered a couple of ways. In Egyptian, from Egyptian, it can be rendered Shutu. It can also be rendered Sudu. And I looked at his map, and where does he put Shutu? Right on top of el-Hammam. Whoa. And then I realized that there is the objective shift from Egyptian into any of the Semitic languages in which you add the mem, becoming Shutum or Sudum, which is exactly what we find in the Old Testament. Sudum. So in the Middle Bronze Age Egyptian execration text, the location of our site is called Shutu or Sudum. That's a no-brainer right there. But then something else is there too. In the Late Bronze Age, the name of that site changed. After the Middle Bronze Age, the name of the site changed to Abel. This is on the Egyptian map list from the 18th dynasty and the 19th dynasty. Well documented. The name of our site, of that area that we're in, went from Shutu to Abel. What does the Egyptian word Abel mean? It's also recorded in the Egyptian, in the Hebrew. To mourn a catastrophe. To mourn a catastrophe. From Shutu to Abel. What happened to take us from one to the other? There was an event. And that's all I have to say about that. Not. Okay. I have time for one question?
We can have one question. Who's going to run here first?
All right, claim it.
Has there ever been any comparative studies between the ashes of humans found there and the ones that went through Nagasaki or Hiroshima?
Not yet. But, I mean, all of this, I leave this up to that's really past my pay grade. You know, I'm a humanities guy, an archaeologist, and I get all of that. But when we start talking about all the physiological stuff and get past into the astrophysics and all that, you know, I leave that up to those guys. But yes, no, that's a great question. That's a great, it ought to be done.
Comparative damage.
Yeah, yeah.
Hi, thank you. What is the table in the white jar table that in the slide containing the correlation? What are you correlating?
Well, the correlation there is the directionality of the event. We have been observing for 16 excavation seasons that everything is moving in a southwest to northeast direction. And so when you track those pottery sherds over dozens of meters and through the matrix at different levels, you go, oh, wow, this thing was churning, it was roiling, it was violent, extremely violent. And that's the whole point of that, is to be able to track the directionality of the event itself.
And the diamonds are like the chemical compositions?
The diamonds there are just sherd groups from the same vessel. Yeah.
Shard groups?
Sherd groups, yeah. S-H-E-R-D. Shards are glass and sherds are pottery. So sherd groups, sherd clusters from the same vessel that are scattered over a wide range.
So when you look at that cross-section, that is like how large is that landscape that is being cross-sectioned?
For that one, it's about 20 meters by about 1.5 meters, almost 2 meters in a couple places. So you have sherds up here, same vessel, here, spread through the matrix at multiple levels. So this is the point of that is it's a single event matrix. It was not laid down over a long period of time. It was laid down in a single event.
I see. And are there other circumstances like that? Are there other patches like that?
No one. This has never been seen at another urban site or even settlement site that I know of anywhere in the world.
I mean, within the Jericho, within Sodom itself, are there other plots like that, like other cross-sectional
Yes, all across the site, but not at other sites. Only our site. It's never been seen anywhere. As far as we know, we're the only airburst event over an urban area ever in the history of the world. Till one hits New York, and then it's,
Sorry, one more question. I noted Randall Carlson mentioned yesterday that with Tunguska, that some of the locals had murdered some of the scientists,
Yes.
one or two of the scientists who had gone there to investigate. Do you think that presumably that there could have been a similar kind of taboo that was put in
Yes.
that to sacralize that area?
absolutely, you're absolutely right. Yes, of course. I think part of the reason that people stayed away was not only that the soil was denuded and destroyed, but that the place got such bad juju that nobody went back there. For a long, there was a fear of the site. In fact, there's still fear in some of the locals today to talk about. You don't walk through that site.
I can't believe we have a
Yeah.
recent account of that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, one last question.
Thank you for the presentation. My question has to do with the positioning of where the airburst would have taken place, and considering the length of time between when the event would have taken place and repopulation of the area. Do you think there's any chance that especially given we're talking about an alluvial floodplain, that water from the Dead Sea overtook the area during the airburst, and because of the salinity of the Dead Sea, that it completely destroyed the agricultural areas, and there is no possibility of them replanting within that
Yes.
century or even several centuries later?
Yeah, it's a great observation. The answer is absolutely yes. It's in the paper. And it exploded at a very low altitude. I think it actually even got maybe into the rift itself, maybe about a mile above the north end of the Dead Sea, which would have pushed vast amounts of vaporized anhydride salts and water up over the landscape and mixed it into that destruction matrix. There is a the salt content of the Middle Bronze Age destruction layer is 6 times more concentrated than the Dead Sea, and not above and not below. In fact, after a rain, when we're at the site, after a rain, the next day you go out, it's dried out, and you walk across the lower city, it sounds like you're walking on crunchy snow. It's white. The salt on the surface precipitates out, crunch, 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 crunch. We find lots of pottery with huge salt crystals on it, just like they were in the Dead Sea. And so the Dead Sea water, the Dead Sea salts were vaporized and pushed up over the landscape, and they wind up in the destruction matrix and probably across the landscape itself, which is one of the reasons why they never could get wheat going. Barley will germinate with a little bit higher salt content in the soil than wheat. All of our grain, we had lots of it, it's barley. And but what's interesting about anhydride salts, it's highly water soluble, and rain will wash it out. Just rain will eventually cleanse the landscape. But the problem with inside el-Hammam is it's surrounded by these massive fortifications and ramparts, and so whenever it rains, salt doesn't go anywhere, it just sits. Doesn't run out. And so that preserves the salt content in the Middle Bronze destruction layer inside the city, whereas now farming is done everywhere in the area.
Right. And so you're referring to, when you say the Middle Bronze layer, you're referring to like a soil core and pulling all that out and analyzing it for...
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Yes. Yeah, you have to take samples above, through, and below, and also samples from the whole region to get the regional average. Yeah.
Thank you.
And again, that's not my pay grade. That's all these astrophysicists and geologists.
Huge round of applause for Dr. Stephen Collins.